Okay. Perfect. Well, the book that I present here, Rhetoric for a Democracy in Crisis, a study of political theory, offer a substantial theoretical response to the current democratic crisis, particularly in a context marked by the rise of the liberal and reactionary movements. One of its central aims also is to reconnect political theory to the rhetorical tradition. And the book also, inside this rhetorical tradition, argues for the existence of what I call a Mediterranean democratic rhetorical tradition that has largely remained outside of the contemporary rhetorical current in political theory. In this rhetorical tradition formed by the works of Isocrates, Quintilian, and Giambattista Vico. This tradition, my argument is that their work offers important resources for the contemporary democratic theory, specifically this radical democracy that defends authors as Hannah Arendt or Sheldon Wolin. I will propose here that rhetoric is not only an art, it's also a democratic idea, but it's also a form of knowledge. I understand in this book rhetoric as a science. Finally, the book seeks to deepen a concept of the political very different from the Schmittian framework that has strongly shaped contemporary populism. And it closes with a critical discussion of left-wing populism and proposes as an alternative a rhetorical and democratic understanding of the political, one grounded in plurality, democratic judgment, and openness to contingency, to the future, and to alterity, to the others, based in this current rhetorical tradition that I told you, and the works of Arendt and Wolin. Well, this is like the framework of the book. Now I will pass to explain a little more about it. The first chapter works as a preface and explains the intellectual trajectory behind the English edition of the book. I published this book last year, but the original edition in Spanish was from 2010, and in these 15 years it has passed a lot of things in the political arena, also personally, and I had to reconstruct the work, and in this preface I explain how I did it. Then this new edition emerged after a process of revision. This involved reassessing the original argument, updating the biography, and further developing a latent concept of the political that had become increasingly relevant in light of the current democratic crisis. I consider that the political horizon, had changed historically from 2010 to 2025. The title itself reflects this shift. In the first edition, I titled the book Rhetoric, Democracy and Crisis. In this one, I changed to Rhetoric for a Democracy in Crisis. The change points to a broader argument, a wider understanding of rhetoric that is in this edition, and it also sharpens a key distinction running through the book: the contrast between politics and violence, between rhetoric and propaganda, and between democracy and tyranny. Against a political context increasingly shaped by the reinforcement of executive power, The book argues for cultivating freedom of movement in thinking and democratic government in the inner forum of the citizen in connection with the external one. The Spanish political experience also matters here. The cycle opened in 2011, just 1 year after the publication of the first edition in Spanish. Was in Spain, for example, the movement of the indignados. This was a consequence of this crisis of democracy and continues with the emergence of a left-wing populist party in Spain called Podemos in 2014. This raised urgent theoretical and practical questions, and in my public experience, I started to work as a coordinator in the Congress of Izquierda Unida. The party is a coalition, and inside is the Communist Party, Republican Party, other parties, okay, of the left that are different from Podemos, but we were united in a coalition. I was there almost 4 years, and I could see left-wing populism in action from the practice experience. Then it became increasingly necessary to think critically about elitism, leadership, political propaganda, and the populist justification of these strong leaderships and this political division between us and them around the concept of the people and the concept of oligarchy. By 2025, with the end of the political cycle for the left in Spain, the need for alternative theoretical foundations had become even more pressing. I think it's not only an affair that war in Spain is about here in Portugal, in Latin America, in other countries. I think we have a need of the renovation of the theoretical basis of progressive left parties and movements after this cycle where the populist framework was so important. Then I rewriting this book. I said at the beginning it was like a palimpsest, rewriting over an earlier text while allowing traces of the first version to remain small, but also introducing new sections, new reflections, new themes, reworking the argument, and replacing the final chapters with a new concluding. I start, as in the first edition, with 2 chapters dedicated to the relationship between political theory and political science. I think that political theory has often suffered a loss of credibility, like in words of Miranda Fricker, we can say that she's testimonial justice. Because if you say something from political theory, some political scientists often say, okay, it's speculative, it's story, it's literary, it's philosophical. And I had this problem when I started my career as a researcher, and I thought that it was important to understand very good the origin of this situation, and the book then begins with the origins of academic political science in the United States. Because of its influence and of these internal and external divisions of the discipline and the mode, how they think the discipline to be celebrated. Then this chapter examines how the discipline was gradually consolidated as a sovereign academic project, defined through increasingly clear disciplinary boundaries, separating it from history, the Protestant moral philosophy, and the legal study of the state. these three disciplines for the beginners of the North American political science was important to fix this boundary because these fields were thought as non-scientific. Then the pioneers wanted to be a scientific discipline to be heard by the others. Then I study all the field of the history of political science with authors like John Farr, John Bunnell, Dorothy Ross, Mark Bever, and Robert Adcock, between others, and I make my own hypothesis about this origin and how they try to expel political theory outside also these boundaries. At the same time, during these beginnings, political science increasingly embraced methodological rigor and positivist assumptions, developments that would eventually lead to the so-called behavioral revolution as is known. Against this background, the chapter also explores a broader tension, the attempt to push political theory beyond, as I told you, and the increasingly narrow methodological framework established by political science. The book reinterprets political theory as part of an older conflict in the Western political thought. The long struggle between rhetoric and the dominant traditions of philosophical and scientific method, from Plato to René Descartes, were the antecedents of this new quarrel between political theory and political science. That is one of the theses of the book. Following in this case to Leo Strauss, Wolin, Hannah Arendt, and Sheldon Wolin, I try to, in the second chapter, to combine the defense of political theory that these great authors have done in the 50s and the 60s with their now classical works. I made a distinction between the differences between their defenses, but also I try to combine all the common points that they have in this work. An approach to the past that moves beyond linear narratives of progress, beyond established canon, and beyond antiquarian readings. It involves then certain freedom to weave together different historical moments in order to think more carefully about the present. They try to do a political theory open to contingency, to the imagination, and in this concept by Sheldon Wolin of vision, capable of conceptualizing what is new in the political events of the political arena, and also closely connected to democratic understanding and judgment. This kind of political theory, I think, puts the basis of the political theory of the 21st century. For example, in the United States, the perestroika movement in their academy at the beginning of this century challenged the persistence of positivism and the dominance of the normal science in political science. But the response to relativism and denialism cannot be a return to a rigid expert authority. In my opinion, what is needed instead is a post-normal science, open, democratic, attentive to uncertainty, and capable of theoretical imagination. We are seeing this, the eco-social crisis discussion, Ravage and Funderwich in the 90s coined this concept of normal science, and I think that rhetoric is a good vehicle to build this approach to science that we need in our times. Well, in the in the next chapter about Benjamin and Arendt, I want to make a bridge between this discussion between political theory and political science and the rhetoric tradition that I want to link with. One of the first questions is why rhetoric matters today. And I want to answer distinguishing between rhetoric and propaganda. I think this is a polemic and it's really a difficult distinction because we are accustomed to hear that we have a good rhetoric and a bad rhetoric. We have an art of persuasion, and maybe it is used to enforce democracy, but maybe sometimes it's used to weaken democracy. I sustain and maintain that this is not useful, and this is not what this tradition that I want to recover is saying in the works of Isocrates, Quintilian, and Vico. Instead, I maintain that there is a clear distinction between what is rhetoric and how do we use it to democracy, and what is propaganda and how it is used to enforce tyranny. Then the understanding of rhetoric as a purely instrumental art aimed at persuasion, divorced from any ethical reflection, lies at the root of a confusion that continues to shape contemporary debates. Especially at large scale, disinformation strategies have become one of the greatest threats to democratic life today as we know. In an age of rising populism, authors like Goldberg and Origi say that a conceptual distinction between persuasion that is legitimate and not is present. My core claim here is instead that rhetoric is not linked to persuasion when we understand like this. Propaganda for democracy is an oxymoron as rhetoric for tyranny would be. The intrusion of propaganda, I made some explorations of some definitions of propaganda. I take mine and I try to construct by myself an own definition from all the others. And I say that the intrusion of propaganda operates through a calculated use of logical arguments, the amplification of specific emotions, and the strategic involvement of institutions or public figures capable of lending credibility to a broad audience. It involves then a discursive mobilization of logos, pathos, and ethos aimed at invading, controlling, and directing large groups toward specific political positions through deception, whether by outright lies or selective groups. The objective is to convert and to persuade by manipulating the public at scale. To do so, the propaganda has to divide the public space, and the fragmentation of a shared public space is a requisite for this, both external and internal, in the inner form of the citizenship. This helps explain all the mental health issues, increasingly tied to social isolation and the breakdown of communication that we suffer today. Then, in my definition, propaganda is described as the organized invasion of citizens' internal public space. The internal public space is a concept that I take from Javier Ruiz and Silvina Vázquez, two of the members of that mythical seminar that Giuseppe told you before, and I try to put in relationship with this operation in the propaganda action. Strategic manipulation through the use of logical arguments is trying to invade these spaces, this internal space of the citizenship. Um, Well, I argue here that also the decline of rhetoric in modernity, contrary to to what many of its critics assume, ultimately cleared the way for a landscape increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. We are accustomed also to hear that rhetoric, when critics say that rhetoric is equivalent to manipulation. But in the in our current time, we are seeing that rhetoric is only in this kind of seminars. Their influence is really in decline today, and in the newspapers, when we read the word rhetoric, we maybe read it as a synonym of manipulation, of discourse, but not with all this deep thinking that all the rhetorical tradition puts on the table. But today, we are also facing one of the greatest threats to democracy by manipulation, precisely of this propaganda. Then, one of my arguments is what is uh, uh, going here, because this is a contradiction. If rhetoric is really weak, I don't understand why we are surrounding for these manipulation threats. Then, one of the defining features of what this study refers to as Mediterranean democratic rhetoric lies in the fact that, unlike earlier approaches, it resists being equated with convincing, the idea of persuasion as a form of conquest of others, of persuasion. In the words of Isocrates, Quintilian, and Vico, rhetoric is not grounded in utility but aimed at cultivating honest and dignified citizens who remain free from invasive technical. Technical training in rhetoric, where relevant, is directed toward dissent in service of democratic life, but the ethos of rhetoric is fundamentally civic and democratic. This is what I defend from the authors that I study here. I think I have 5 minutes, then I'm going to try to go a little faster in the next chapters. After this reflection, this bridge, this chapter that I told you as a bridge to our current worries, I started to study Isocrates and Quintilian. I think they are two authors not very much followed in the studies of rhetoric, especially Isocrates. And I was surprised always with this when I say Isocrates. Almost everyone in non-specialized forums says to me, Socrates, are you talking about Socrates? It's another one, it's Isocrates. For him, rhetoric is not conquest through persuasion. Isocrates understood his rhetoric philosophy by the speech aimed at cultivating citizens capable of good judgment. The misuse of language, in his view, had reached such extremes in 4th century Athens that he held it chiefly responsible for the growing political crisis facing the polis. His pedagogical and theoretical project would thus be guided by a single question: how to improve democracy. Eulerein, how to speak well, help us distinguish between what is just and unjust. Philosophia serves us as a path for cultivating this discernment, and in doing so, for becoming better citizens. In Socrates is very important the openness to the future, to the contingency, and to alterity. This double openness is crucial for democracy. We have to accept the self and our identities as always open to contingency and to alterity. And this democratic idea educate the citizen to be open to accept this contingency and this alterity in the construction of the political community. These are the basis of I interpret like that for Quintilian. When Quintilian was recovered in 1416, his work and Isocrates' works was like the basis of the non-Platonic humanism of the Renaissance. And this is not casual. Quintilian has authored an earlier treatise to its Institutionis Oratoriae, titled De Causis Corruptae Valentiae, on the causes of corrupted eloquence. Then he said that the rhetoric is a bene dicendi scientia, is the science of speaking well, and he distinguished this from that corrupted eloquence very clearly. Rhetoric, therefore, becomes civic and integral education in his work. It's an interdisciplinary knowledge. This is very interesting. It takes some similarities here from Cicero, like a comprehensive model of education that includes in his work geometry, music, and of course philosophy, ethics, and history. But I think one of the most original insights of Quintilian is related to the recognition of difference, plurality, and inclusion. When he defends the inclusion of childhood as complete citizens, they are also recognized as citizens with virtues that the adults have not, as memory, and also it is a linkage with the how Quintilian refuses the model of Aristotle of the surveillance and punishment to the childs and the Aristotle recommendation of govern them as a king. Then in this theoretical insight, Quintilian is giving us some aspects, theoretical aspects of inclusion, very rich. Well, finally, Quintilian, also as Socrates, has made a defense of the very similar. The very similar is something very important in this tradition. We are not talking about doxa, about only opinion that is really far from truth. We are not talking about this truth. We are talking with something that is similar to truth. And when we explain our positions in the political arena, we are doing it with honesty. We are doing it like Isocrates defend that could improve democratia, respecting differences between citizens and trying to construct a common arena from these differences. Finally, the vir bonus dicendi peritus in Quintilian is a really crucial sentence because, first of all, is vir bonus and then dicendi peritus. You are the good orator, the good citizen. For him is the vir bonus that then maybe he could be a dicendi peritus. But important is the vir bonus. After that, I went in the next chapter to Giambattista Vico. Giambattista Vico, the link with Quintilian is interesting because he had to obtain his chair in rhetoric in the University of Naples, talking about Quintilian. Also, Quintilian was attacked by Pedro Ramos, and Vico, in this old quarrel, have had to defend his position against the Cartesian method that is inherited in part of the method of Ramos. These linkages, lead us to again the relationship between the growing self-misgovernment of the individual and the deepening disorder of the political community. This is a main theme in all the authors that I treat in the book. We have to cultivate the citizen soul with this paideia, democratic paideia, and in Vico we are really worried about the government of the self. In his inaugural orations, we can see how Vico is treating this thing and his relationship with the external forum. This relationship between the inner forum and the external forum is another of these things. I go directly. You have in the book more details, for example, how Vico, respecting the Enlightenment debates about Judaism, how it, and maybe in the Giovanni's comment we can enter in more details, no? And this is important also to link this chapter and this tradition and my argument that this is a direct connection to Arendt and Arendt's works. Okay, for Arendt, I try to study the freedom of movement concept. Freedom of movement again in the world. It's important to inhabit the world is the oldest and elementary concept of freedom, but also its relationship with the importance of freedom of movement for the free thought. This is the other important linkage that Arendt do between the inner and the external forum. This concept serves as a bridge between the self-government and democratic aspiration of the city. It echoes again the rhetorical tradition of Isocrates, Quintilian, and Vico. Freedom for Arendt is not something isolated, sovereign, or self-contained. It is not the same as unchecked executive will. At the end, I also try to put some contradictions of Arendt in her trying to refuse the non-contradiction principle in thinking. She said that harmony is a metaphor, a musical metaphor that says that we can speak with ourselves, and the friendship in ourselves is fundamental to the friendship outside. But I think she had not the courage, maybe, to break with that principle at all, because she fears that it divides the self of the citizen, and this is, I think, a stop to plurality in the inner forum that maybe had consequences to the plurality outside. Then I use the harmony metaphor and the counterpoint metaphor to say that in music we could put together more than two notes, more than A, B, C, the form and the accords and these harmonies and counterpoints emerge as freedom of association and as encounter a form of resistance, an antidote to the executive orders of the will. And finally, the political first. This chapter aims to put the concept of the political of Arendt in relationship with its continuation by Sheldon Wolin and as an antidote and an alternative to the concept of the political by Carl Schmitt used by the populists. I think here we all know well this Schmittian concept of the political and how it works in the populist movements. But I think with all this rhetorical tradition and democratic, radical democracy tradition of Arendt and Wolin, we have an alternative that say to us that power is not violence, that politics is not equivalent to the violence, and it's not the continuation of violence with other means. Is the power of the citizenry rhetorically imagined as well taking equal part in public speech to decide collectively to exercise this autonomy. It does. So not as a uniform mass preparing for battle, but by honoring the truth embedded in each doxa, the radical plurality of each self. I also describe how this concept of the political why has its primacy over the social, and why the political and democracy for Wolin are almost synonymous. And finally, I try to recover the concepts by Wolin of fugitive democracy, politicalness, and his recognizing of differences. Well, I hope that in the discussion now we can enter maybe in more details. I hope to make you a framework of the book, despite my I think not very good English. Sorry for this, but well, I'm really open to your comments now. Thank you very much.